Cool. So what I'd ask, so we know Pierre. So what I'd say is we'll kick off with you, Simon. So if you could introduce yourself and then explain what you do in this space.
So I'm Simon. I founded Simwood back in '96 as the world's first global gateway between the internet and mobile phones, which both look like they might catch on. We've been about a while, had APIs since before there was APIs, and done various other things for a long time. But we've been a voice providers carrier since probably about 2005. In this particular space, we've researched and published on VoIP fraud since the early 2000s, and there's dozens and dozens of hours on YouTube of me waxing lyrical about how it all works. And if anybody's interested in a free book, we've got things on it. But more recently, we've been in the space of what I would call intelligent minutes. So we're providing services to obviously the traditional carrier space, but increasingly what I'd call post-service provider enterprises that are so sophisticated they don't need a service provider. And the financial community is a massive, massive part of that. So we're very fortunate to be in the pipeline where 60% of the world's credit card transactions get screened, and more significantly, we're directly involved in the US and Western Europe in combating fraud against the fraud mitigation systems. There was previously an assumption that the voice channel and the SMS channel was secure, and banks in particular are waking up to the realization that they're not. So in real time, we're providing some measure of trust and verification on calls into and out of the enterprise based on the unique signaling access that we have as a carrier, data feeds similar to Pierre talked about, and relationships.
Oh, sorry, just go through. Pierre, you've introduced yourself to Tom.
Hi, my name is Thomas Howe. I design communications products, and I'm the founder and CTO of 10-Digit Communications. And my interest has been in pushing our art forward and designing products for the first time. So I do.
Hi, Todd Carothers here, Chief Revenue Officer at Counterpath. Some of you in the VoIP community may have heard of a product called Xlite. That's us. We have over 20 million clients that have been downloaded, deployed, and been doing it now for almost 17 years. Counterpath has, not me, but almost 17 years, 11 years for me. But so we started in that space, a lot of early on work in the ITF around standardization of SIP compliant soft phones, things like that. Today, though, it's not really so much about the soft phone itself. It's more about collaboration and those type of products, particularly targeted towards the open source market, or those that have taken an open source platform and want to build something that can compete from a services perspective with the likes of Cisco and others out there on a services level. So that's what I represent, and that's where I'm coming from. And I really enjoyed your presentation, Pierre. I thought it was great because I'm not on that side of it at all. I'm on the endpoint side of it. So those things are not really, in our kind of bailiwick of concern on a daily basis. So I really enjoyed it because I did learn a ton there. Our kind of where we come from in this whole discussion is simply from the endpoint side, which is a lot of these things that Pierre talked about are kind of thought about already. And by the time it gets to us, we got to make sure that we have an endpoint that can't be hacked, and if it can be hacked, what data is available there to those that do hack it, and then how does it get distributed down to millions of users and then connect into the service and things like that. So we're more on the kind of physical layer of things, and then upward to the application side where things like on the signaling TLS is really important, SRTP, those standard-based, older technologies that are just kind of proven out, kind of come into play. We also do a lot in the MDM and EMM space in terms of working with vendors as a way of security and privacy and also to fight fraud as well. So that's another area that we really, kind of play with, the likes of good BlackBerry, Citrix, AirWatch, and others like that. But for us, it was interesting because for us, it's very different because we're really focused around kind of the endpoint side and not some of the schemes behind it that you highlighted, which I thought were great to hear.
Cool. Thanks so much, Todd. Because as was said, well, by Thomas several times, it's always an end-to-end solution. Yeah. So that's why I was keen we had you all on there. So looking at businesses now are integrating more and more workflows thanks to programmable telecoms. So we now got across the PBX or UC. We're seeing a lot of these platforms exposing capabilities. I'm just interested from each of your perspectives on where you see some of the emerging battlefronts in fraud, given the space that you're in. So I'll start with you again, Simon, because you've written the book.
Okay, well, fraud is different things to different people. I think Pierre covered three aspects that they deal with. We deal with two of those three. The one that we is validating identity of potential customers. The two that we do are toll fraud, which frankly, if there wasn't such a level of apathy at a technical level amongst the ITSP and carrier community, would have been solved 20 years ago. The data's there, the mechanics are there, people just need to give a toss when the equipment, frankly. We provide all the tools on the back end to contain the damage when they don't do that. Probably the most quoted phrase in my email is, I must do something about implementing your fraud controls. That always precedes somebody being woken up on Christmas Day because they've been compromised. But as a business, we can tell them they're going to be compromised now a couple of months in advance of it happening, because the indicators of toll fraud are there long before what people would normally consider to be the actual toll fraud. And when you look at the data, we've got donkey's years of hot data now. When you look at that and analyze it, it really comes down to about 20 unique numbers that uniquely know and block on the network. As new ones crop up and hit the honeypots, we block those network-wide immediately. So maybe famous last words, but toll fraud is a problem that shouldn't be a problem for people that care about it. The emerging threat, the second aspect that we look at is financial fraud, and that is rather like trying to nail jelly to a wall. We do lots of the stuff that Pierre talked about in detecting SIM swap and that kind of thing. I suspect we do it in a slightly different way in different geographies. But we do other things that as a carrier, because we have access to data such as porting fraud and user location and things like that. But the emerging one and the scary one, to my mind, and the one that we're battling hard with, is what I would call the back-end intercept. So I can go on the dark web sometime this evening, go in a chat room, and I can guarantee within probably 5 or 10 minutes, aside from the people offering me stolen credit cards, somebody will be offering me a back-end intercept. And for those of you that don't know what this is, all of the mobile phone networks are connected via a protocol called SS7. They need to be connected to enable you to hop off a plane and service provider query your home service provider and see if you can have service. Via manipulation of some of that data behind the scenes, which you can do with simply access to the protocol, and tightening but still lacks security standards at some of the operators. Effectively, for $200, somebody can man in the middle your mobile number and have all of your calls and all of your SMS unencrypted with you completely unaware of it. So unlike SIM swap, where you might realize that you've got no phone service half an hour after you've lost all your money, with the back-end intercept, you've got no idea it's going on. This is widely used in espionage circles, has been for donkey's years, but it is now commoditized for use in financial fraud. So for $200, you can own somebody's mobile identity, and that has an ROI if they've got more than $200 in the bank account that you've also compromised.
And Todd, just interested in, from an endpoint perspective,
Yes.
what you see as some of the emerging battlefronts.
Yeah, I mean, from an endpoint perspective, I kind
endpoint
of gave
perspective. You're the endpoint guy.
Yeah, so I gave a little bit of my intro, but we obviously on the mobile network or whatever network you're on, for us it's all about VoIP. So if it doesn't have a VoIP connection, we don't really apply because that's what we do. And luckily in VoIP there's no fraud. Just kidding. There's tons of fraud, and actually, for us it's really around making sure that, and where our customers focus on is making sure that the user that enters credentials are entering credentials for them and making sure that that is them. And so and how we handle it is we have a provisioning server that connects directly to our clients and authenticates the clients and also works with other databases that the customers manage through a secure interface as well, and in many cases through Microsoft Active Directory too, depending on how they want to deploy. But for us, that's kind of the key component of it, because as we all know, if the VoIP providers won't give you SIP credentials typically, like the large, especially consumer base like Comcast. So our customers don't want to do that either. So they want to make sure there's a provision down and that the fraudsters don't get access to it. So for us, we manage that through the endpoint to a provisioning server, typically ours. That's highly secure.
Excellent, thanks. I want to skip over the Robo Calling. We'll come back to that one. But because you talked about provisioning and auto-provisioning, I was just interested, mobile phones becoming SIP endpoints for corporate networks. It's VPN out. So with auto-provisioning, is there new hybrid fraud management risks, like proxy user authentication? I don't know whether it's too glib a question.
Can you reframe the question? Can you say the question?
Yeah. I've just seen, I was reading an article around sort of, hybrid fraud management risks, and, it was talking around like sort of, proxy user authentication when you have auto-provisioning, because quite often that's just left on. It's just there, so you basically sort of, it automatically registers, so you can intercept that, if you put, I can't remember the exact details, so I might be sort of being a bit glib on this, but, again, I guess we'll skip over that if I just
I can say something on
Yeah.
auto-provisioning if you want, because it's something I've banged on about for the best part of 10 years. Auto-provisioning relies on the fact that you plug a phone in and it makes a call home. It makes a call home with its MAC address, which is in theory a globally unique identifier. The manufacturer then redirects that to a provisioning server for the ITSP that happens registered that MAC address. The problem with that is manifold. A MAC address isn't a globally unique identifier. They're allocated in blocks to manufacturers. They then sub-allocate them by product. So if you know which phone a particular ITSP tends to deploy, you can get a reasonably close guess to the sequential block of MAC addresses they're going to be using. Furthermore, different vendors have different levels of competence on this, and some of them have caught up in recent years, but it's fair to say most of them are well below where they should be. Where they do use encryption, in many cases, if you cut the firmware, the certificates are there, but in a lot of cases they don't use encryption. So, and furthermore, these auto-provisioning servers tend to be boxes in a corner of an ITSP's network that sit there serving out config, and nobody really monitors them. So, long story short, a script kiddie can compromise auto-provisioning and download effectively credentials for an entire ITSP's customer base with a relative degree of ease.
Yeah. And maybe not so much on proxy-based or proxy authentication, but one of the things that is very critical to our deployments is because we are a soft phone. Like Simon just mentioned, a lot of provision servers are kind of forgotten about. We've seen that actually, which surprised the heck out of us. Because for us, being that we're software, we're very dynamic. We have over 600 settings in our phone that can be adjusted, and it's growing every day for us. And so every time you log in, you actually get an XML bundle from our provisioning server that changes the settings depending on what the IT organization has done. So that's kind of one point. The other point is that for us, we absolutely do certain, on our deployment models, it will change depending on what customers we deal with. So sometimes, we mentioned Nigeria earlier, sometimes we have customers that are in areas that have a lot of fraud issues and things like that. There's a bunch of places all over the world. But we'll actually, we will redirect the provisioning to different provisioning servers and actually pretty much do a forward across these different servers so that we can intercept them.
Okay.
So that if there is an issue and we see something that is inflated, because we'll see that all of a sudden on our provisioning side, a bunch of transactions happening, we'll get an alarm and then we can kind of go investigate that kind of thing.
Okay, that's clear. That's clear. Because that sort of overlaps with the last question around, from the VoIP world, there's just been so many processes that have been implemented that, mitigate a lot of the risks. I mean, like I mentioned here, in terms of prepay or as near real-time billing as you can get, so that you can basically sort of trigger. So again, with the auto-provisioning, what you're seeing is you're monitoring this so in near real-time, as soon as you see a spike, you can react to that. So that's cool. So do we have any questions from the audience? If not, I'll just finish on the one I skipped over, which is Robo Calling. It's fashionable, the shake and stirred, but again, I'm just interested in your perspective. Do you see your solutions as being a way you can help your customers in mitigating illegal robocalling or maybe semi-legal robocalling? Because Eric pointed out that there are providers out there that, so yeah, go for it. Anybody got a comment on that?
I have
Right. So I actually had one thing around that, and I think as you may have heard my first talk around smartphone design, one of the hangovers that you can see from our landline legacy as we move to smartphones is in the way we actually use the phone. And what you may have noticed when you use a smartphone is you text each other first, usually, and the texting is the precipitant to the call. We have a text-first model. And I think one of the reasons why robocalls are even a thing is because we've accepted for quite a while that people can just call you without the messaging that normally applies to you talking to a friend. So, I guess the point is, this might be an example of how this is a symptom of just a bad call model one day. Then it actually is a long-term problem that we have to solve.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Just hang on a sec. There we go. Okay, Dinesh.
From Pierre on the whole burner phones. One of the challenges is, what happens when you have number portability now in many of the Asian countries, so you have number portability. How would you handle that problem? Because now its number is not with the same courier it was, it can be with multiple. From a fraud standpoint, like it's similar to burner phones or SIM soft or
again, that's 1,000. Carrier, no. Type of. Not only a question. And you. Carrier. All of us. Alors, optimal. For reaching.
They're not picking up your audio. Could you just get a bit closer?
Oh yeah, so before reaching that point, we'll probably have a RCS solution fully launched, but other type of attributes help capturing of risk. but it will never be 100.
So, yeah, it's interesting hearing about SIM-swap in a US context, because I tend to regard SIM-swap as a European and an Asian phenomenon. And when I consider its equivalent in the US, I actually think of porting, because I think the porting process is probably, well, one positive is very efficient, but another, the corollary of that is open to abuse. In terms of how we identify that, we're now a licensed carrier in the US, so we have access to various databases. So it's fairly trivial. Just as with SIM-swap, you would try to determine when the IMSI associated with a certain phone number or the SIM associated with a certain phone number last changed. It's no different with porting. When did this number last port? And if it's 2 hours ago, and as Pierre said, there's a whole load of other indicators that squeaky bottoms, then you're going to be more suspicious about that call or that transaction. On robocalling, I like being controversial, but I'm also going to be complimentary. In the US, you don't have a problem. And the reason I say that is that I suspect you're only seeing about 25% of the robocalls you would otherwise see if the carriers over here and the regulatory environment over here hadn't done such a lot of work. So, and the basis for that opinion is that we've come from the European market into the US. We have European ways of working as a carrier. We have European standards around call quality and things. Coming into the US market with the same global financial customers as we have in Europe, we have traffic that looks like dialer in some cases. So if a bank is calling you to query a credit card transaction or to perform collections, they tend to be short duration calls. There tends to be a high volume of them. All of the indicators that point to bad robocalls are very similar with this good traffic. And the controls in place across the various carriers, from penalties in place on contracts for kind of global aggregate traffic statistics, right the way down to inter-carrier blacklisting of numbers that have exhibited bad behavior, right the way through to stir shaken and other things that are happening at a higher level to combat this, aren't, in my experience, happening anywhere else. In the UK and in Europe, there are none of those contractual restrictions. There are none of those mandated top-down controls. We need them. We'd welcome them. But compliments to the FCC and the carrier community over here. You guys are well ahead of the curve, even though it may not feel that way as consumers getting annoyed by these things.
That's interesting. Thanks for that, Simon. Yeah, no, appreciate that.
And
Thomas?
yeah, just one endpoint perspective on fraud, and because I think it's kind of a funny use case, but it's real. We've been working on smartphone designs to enable sports betting for outdoor events. And part of the problem with sports betting is people all in the audience tend not to download the mobile application, so you want to use the phone itself to make a bet. And you have to validate that the person making the bet is old enough to make the bet.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good example of that kind of number fraud when the kid takes the father's phone to start betting on the Jets. And so this is actually a small use case of many larger use cases of fraud, not at the transaction level, but at the impersonation level. I'm signing a contract, I'm pretending to be you in a workflow, et cetera. And the things that we found that actually make a little bit of difference around it are to look at some of the fundamentals that the phone number can provide to you, like Pierre's talk adequately really put together, but also things like biometrics. Take a picture of your face, take a picture of your license, send them in, do they match? Send me in another selfie if too much time has gone on, et cetera. And that's again, I think it's a funnier version of number fraud, the kid, but not mentioned.
Yeah, but where there is such strict penalties around underage betting, I mean, that's a great example where it's so simple.
Yeah, and by the way, if you're outside this country, it is a thing. It's going to happen. Every major league has their lawyers fighting for their percentage of it, and it's in-game betting, basically. You know, who's going to get the next score?
That demonstrates why context is so critical. This
Indeed,
stuff.
so yes, exactly. Yeah, yep.
Cool. Do we have anything else from the audience? Oh, go for it.
Just to follow on your, you call it Robo Calling. So, and I agree with you, Simon, that here we've got less robocalls than you'd expect. There's a lot of things going on. I think what we get is a lot of people who go onto a website or make something online, and then that company and 15 other companies start calling you, right? And that's kind of not really for fraud purposes. They're trying to get some business, right? But the one thing that we didn't really talk about is how do I, since I can't block an SMS from a VoIP number that doesn't exist, right? So basically, an SMS robocall. How do you block that baby? Right? Because I do get them. Right? They come in from some number that is not an actual end number, and it says, this system called me, and it's not for me.
Yep.
Right? The text tells me this. So how do you block that one? I get an SMS from a number that is not an actual real phone number.
Well, it's not a real person. There's some bot that's pumping out, like, asking you to click on some URL, from there. It's just. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. But it could be a SIM box that's just pumping out stuff to get. Yeah.
It could.
Yeah.
It's basically a voice over IP type PBX that doesn't have actual real numbers behind it. It's got a whole bunch of numbers buried in it that are not recognizable as country codes, et cetera.
To your point about you can falsify CLI on a voice call, but you can't on an SMS, that's not actually correct. You spoof the originator on an SMS just easily, and certainly in Europe, we have alphanumeric originators. So a lot of the spam SMS that we'll get won't come from a number at all. It will come from PPI claims, whatever. And that's untraceable other than from the carrier. You can't even reply to it because you can't respond to an alphanumeric destination. Since I've hogged the mic again, I'll go answering the question. Where for our customers, we're in the pipeline of calls into and out of the network and able to use signal intelligence to provide metrics around those. We do exactly the same with SMS.
Okay. Anything else from anybody else? If not, no, that was a great question. Do you have any other questions from the audience? Go for it.
So, Simon, I just want to, I guess, maybe elaborate a little bit on what you said about what's going on here in the U.S. to combat robocalling and what you see in other markets around the world. So it's a kind of a two-part question. One is, do you suspect that there's not much work done to combat robocalling elsewhere in the world because there are not targets that are as ripe elsewhere in the world? I guess that's question number one, or what else? So here in the U.S., there's a lot of public outcry about this, and if there's not elsewhere, that would maybe be one reason why there's not as much being done to combat it. And then the second part of that is, so if this is a U.S. solution, stir shaken, how successful is it going to be given the fact that it's not being implemented elsewhere?
So there's a few questions wrapped up in there, Warren. I think you look at, I wouldn't say we get any fewer robocalls, but I think culturally we're quite different. In the UK, we might tut. In France, they probably shrug their shoulders and set something on fire. Over here, you guys say something. So there's the cultural difference. If you look at the causes, you're a bigger market, you're a wealthy market, so you could argue that makes you a target. In terms of the cost of propagating this, if you're actually paying for the phone calls, it's cheaper to do so in the US than it is in Europe, although that trend is changing as a result of the measures that are being put in place. And when I say it's changing, there's an interesting thing when it comes to robocalls, that if you stop the man in the street, I'll tell you what, I'll do a quick here. Do robocalls originate on VoIP or TDM? Who says VoIP? Oh, are you scratching your head, Dean? Who says TDM then? By definition, by implication, that's the rest of you.
Everybody's saying TDM, yeah.
In the carrier networks, the VoIP networks tend to have these big, expensive SBCs that engineers don't have quite as much confidence in as they do the battle-tested, steam-powered TDM switch that's been there for 50 years and is, a bought and paid-for asset on the balance sheet. So in terms of propagating these things, many of the big carriers actually sell the ability to pass traffic that would otherwise violate their own quality standards. They enforce those quality standards rigorously on the VoIP side of things. On the TDM side of things, they'll happily sell you a PRI to fill all day long with junk calls, because it's bought, it's paid for, and they're going to charge you a higher rate for those calls because they know the type of traffic it's going to attract. To your other point, Warren, about stir shaken, we're considering half of that in the UK, and my views on the UK regulatory regime are there in black and white on our blog for anybody to read, but to put it politely, they're a bunch of idiots. Half of stir shaken isn't particularly useful. The whole thing is, and we're really looking forward to it in a fraud context, because just like Pierre was saying, the origin of a call presenting a given CLI, which carrier interconnect it came over, is significant to us. If it suddenly comes in from an unexpected route, that's significant for us. Stir shaken is going to add an extra layer of certification to that enables us to cascade that further beyond actually the immediately interconnected carrier. Not going to help with internationally originated calls, but you would hope they would be filtered and identified by the carrier entering them onto the domestic network. So we still have a data point to do something there with.
And I suggest that with that, we thank the panel for an excellent discussion. Thanks a lot, guys. So that ends a long day. We've covered a lot. So I believe the drinks will be there soon. So if we turn up there and we look thirsty, they'll bring the drinks out for us. Well, actually, I think we have to go into a little cubby hole to get our drinks and then bring them out, I think. Is that the procedure?
You have to hide your cocktail service in this building. So you can get a drink, but it's like a speakeasy. You go through a little door and they serve you.
So there is a procedure, but you know the process. Okay, guys? So again, thank you so much for staying to the end, and see you tomorrow.